Well, welcome to the 700 Club. A landmark decision from the Supreme Court on voting rights, and the ruling could have implications for the entire country.
Conservatives praised the decision, but Democrats called the Arizona law, quote, voting restrictions, and they're pushing their plan to give Washington more control over elections across America. Jennifer Wishon has the story.
In a 6-3 ruling, the High Court upheld voting laws in Arizona, which prompted Democrats to renew their push for a sweeping elections overhaul. In an opinion written by Justice Alito, the court ruled 2 Arizona voting laws constitutional. The laws require votes cast in the wrong precinct to be thrown out and ban so-called ballot harvesting, where voters give their ballots to someone else to turn in.
These measures are designed to provide order and secure the elections and provide confidence in the results.
Opponents argue the laws violate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits voting practices that discriminate on the basis of race or color. In this case, Native Americans who have difficulty accessing mail routes.
For somebody who lives in a rural community where you may live 50 or 75 miles from a post office box that you share with a bunch of other families because they're hard to come by, then that's a whole different story.
But the court argued that the law generally makes it quite easy to vote, and conservatives say the measures offer protections against possible voter fraud. The ruling is encouraging to other states considering similar laws.
Justice Alito made clear in his opinion today, the state has a legitimate interest in preventing and detecting election fraud. And that's exactly what Arizona and these other states are trying to do with these new election-related measures.
Lawmakers in at least 48 states are considering some 380 bills designed to strengthen voting laws. Writing in dissent, Justice Elena Kagan said, referring to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, "What is tragic is that the court has damaged a statute designed to bring about the end of discrimination in voting." The ruling again led to Democratic calls to pass their massive election overhaul bill called the For the People Act. This is exactly why we need federal protections to ensure every American has equal access to the ballot box, tweeted Democrat Senator Jeff Merkley. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand adding, "We can't let the filibuster stand in our way. Our democracy depends on it." But the Democrats' bill may also face legal scrutiny. Republicans argue it's unconstitutional because it takes the power over elections away from the states and gives it to the federal government. And in a separate opinion, justices struck down 6-3 a California law that requires nonprofits to hand over their donor lists. Now, Californians who donate money for or against controversial issues like abortion and others don't have to worry about being exposed and possibly harassed. Jennifer Wishon, CBN News.
There are many things that get me really livid, but this one is getting me really livid, and that has to do with the reaction coming out of the left, that somehow our democracy is at stake, that the federal government has to intervene to stop these voter abuses, that we need to get rid of the Senate filibuster for this, and there was even one call that we need to pack the Supreme Court because of this ruling. And it's a bunch of nonsense. What do these 2 laws do? And they're laws in Arizona, and the first one has to do with a practice called ballot harvesting, where it says it's illegal to harvest ballots from voters, that voters actually have to vote, that you can't go to them and present them a ballot and say, fill this in, and then I'm going to take it for you to the voting precinct, and I will submit your vote for you. That's what ballot harvesting is. Now start imagining the abuses that can happen from ballot harvesting. Imagine a company saying to all of its employees, well, we're going to have voting day and we're going to collect your ballot and we're going to submit your ballot for you. Imagine a neighborhood boss saying, I'm going to collect all the votes from my neighborhood to make sure you guys vote correctly. This is anti-democracy, and I'm just surprised that people would have another opinion on this, and not just another opinion, but start to call for packing the Supreme Court, federal laws that get rid of every single state law on voting rights. This just makes no sense to me at all. The other provision had to do with voting in the precinct where you're authorized to vote, voting in the precinct where you live. Imagine having access, because everybody does have access, to the voter rolls and finding in the voter rolls voters who haven't voted in a long time and then saying, well, I'm now going to have them magically vote in this other precinct where they don't live. That can really happen. And if you allow that and say that's okay, then all you need to do is take over a particular voting precinct and have people say, well, we examined their license and this was a real person and they really voted. It's all designed to prevent voter fraud and stop these kinds of malicious practices so we can all have confidence in our elections. I really do not understand the other side on this, and I applaud the Supreme Court for saying these are common sense rules. They have nothing to do with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This just makes sense. In other news, a new president of the Southern Baptist Convention spoke with CBN News about his agenda for the country's largest Protestant denomination. Ephraim Graham has that story from the CBN Newsroom. Ephraim?
Gordon, that agenda includes unifying a divided denomination, promoting church planting, addressing sex abuse and racial reconciliation. Heather Sells brings us the story.
Ed Litton narrowly won the presidency of the Southern Baptist Convention. He ran on a platform of gospel unity, and that's no doubt his biggest challenge.
We need awakening. We need revival in our hearts.
The 14 million member denomination finds itself at a crossroads, with various factions at odds over how to handle sex abuse and hot political topics like race. At June's annual meeting, outgoing President J.D. Greer chastised the flock.
God has not called us primarily to save America politically. He has called us to make the gospel known to all.
Litton acknowledges there's some tough work to be done.
We need some of these very negative things that have gone on between us to be confessed, dealt with, forgiven.
Still, he's hopeful, noting a wide show of support even after the close election.
They came up and said, hey, I didn't vote for you, but I love you and I'm praying for you.
His immediate challenge: name a task force to oversee an independent investigation of top executives. The concern, how they've dealt with survivors of abuse.
These are very serious problems, and we want to see a solution, but the truth has to be our goal.
He's also focused on racial reconciliation and tells CBN critical race theory is not the answer.
The truth is the power is not in a theory. The power to bring healing and hope and togetherness is in the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Southern Baptists are keenly aware of an ongoing drop in membership. Still, church planting is aggressive and diverse. Last year, more than 800 new congregations joined, with the majority non-Anglo. Litton, a longtime planter, currently pastors in Mobile, Alabama. The son of a sailor in Virginia Beach, he says his mother's friend called the 700 Club years ago when his father's alcoholism had taken over the family.
She called and said, hey, you need to pray for this family. They're in crisis, and we really were.
Shortly after, a local pastor prayed with his dad.
His life was so transformed, he became the most amazing soul winner I've ever known.
It's a mission that clearly helped to prepare his son to lead millions of other soul winners at this crucial moment. Heather Sells, CBN News.
Turning now to the Middle East, where thousands of Palestinians took to the streets of Ramallah and Bethlehem to protest the death of Nazir Banat, a prominent critic of the Palestinian Authority. Prosecutors say he was murdered. As Chris Mitchell reports, the unprecedented demonstrations could pose a serious threat to the rule of PA President Mahmoud Abbas.
For months, Nazir Banat posted videos on Facebook accusing the Palestinian Authority of corruption and betraying the Palestinian cause because it worked closely with Israel. Banat also criticized PA President Abbas for canceling elections that had been scheduled for May. They would have been the first elections in 15 years, and Banat was a candidate. On June 24th, Banat's family says PA security forces burst into his home, beat him with iron rods, and arrested him. He later died in custody. After Banat's death and funeral, thousands mourned him in his hometown of Hebron. And in Ramallah, protesters marched on Abbas's headquarters, blaming the president for Banat's murder. They chanted, "The people want to overthrow the regime." PA Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh says Banat's murder is under investigation and vowed to prosecute those responsible. Casting doubt on that effort, journalist Nadia Harhash expressed the frustration of many fellow Palestinians.
They didn't care and they killed him. That's why it's so dangerous that these people don't care about anything, because they know that they can get away with it.
The European Union, the main donor to the PA, wants an independent murder investigation. And the U.S. State Department said it was deeply disturbed by the reports that non-uniformed members of the Palestinian Authority security forces both harassed and used force against protesters and journalists. Harhash goes on to blame the international community for enabling Abbas to basically rule over a police state.
It's the international money that blesses what's happening to us, and they know that nobody is holding them accountable. And yet the international money enters their pockets. It's not a Palestinian internal affair. It is the international responsibility that we're getting killed because we speak out.
The high-profile murder and protests could also represent a serious threat to Abbas's leadership. Polls show his popularity is decreasing, while support for Hamas, the ruling body in Gaza, is growing. Following the recent Gaza conflict, a Palestinian poll showed Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas leading Abbas by 59% to 27%, a margin of more than 30 points. Before the war, Abbas led Haniyeh by a single percentage point.
It gained them tremendous amount of support within the Palestinian population, because that's unfortunately how you gain support, political support in the Palestinian sector.
That growth also elevated Hamas on the world stage. Lebanese President Michel Aoun welcomed the group's leader, who also visited Morocco, Mauritania, and Egypt. That tour happening while Abbas faces an uprising in the West Bank. For some, it's one more sign that the end of Mahmoud Abbas's rule could be just a matter of time. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
A story we'll continue to follow. Gordon?
Well, we are going to continue to follow this because this is very important for Israel. Is there corruption in the Palestinian Authority? You bet, and it's been there for a long time. Yasser Arafat, a lot of people don't know this particular fact, but supposedly died a billionaire. So how does he get that kind of money? Well, he's getting that kind of money from you and me. Our tax dollars are going to support the Palestinian Authority. And this has been around for a long time. And supposedly it funds the police force for the Palestinians. And supposedly that's supposed to reduce the amount of violence that's directed at Israel. That's not the case at all. And what it does is it props up Abbas, it props up the Palestinian Authority, and literally makes them a police state. Does it do anything for the terrorism directed at Israel? The answer is no, because the ideology behind the Palestinian cause is the same and has been the same since 1948. They want to drive Israel into the sea. They haven't given that up. They teach that to their children. They teach it in schools. Again, our tax dollars go to pay for that. That is sponsored by UNRWA. It's sponsored by the Palestinian Authority. And here's another kicker of what the Palestinian Authority does. They pay the families of terrorists. They pay them a monthly stipend based on how effective their terror act was, how many Jews, how many Israelis were killed in the action. So this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, but to hear our State Department say, well, we're very concerned and we need an investigation. Where have you been for the past couple of decades? But here's the real downside. If Abbas is not in charge, well, you're going to have Hamas. And that's a whole nother elevation of a terror state. The Bush administration had this great ideal that if we have free and open elections in Gaza, We can introduce democracy. Let's have democracy in the Middle East. That was the dream for Iraq. And let's spread democracy all around, and all the promise of Arab Spring and all of that. Well, at the end of Arab Spring, the Muslim Brotherhood took over Egypt, and Hamas was elected to be the leader of Gaza. And we've already seen what Hamas does. They stockpile weapons in their hospitals, in their schools, and they fire 4,000 rockets against Israel. That just happened last month. So what to expect in the future if Hamas wins and they control now Hebron, Ramallah, and not just Gaza? The number of attack points that will be set up against Israel. It's a recipe for disaster. When will Europe wake up? When will the UN wake up? And when will our own State Department wake up? You can't fund terrorism. You can't fund an ideology that's fundamentally against what you believe, and fundamentally against democracy, fundamentally against peace. We need, number one, to stop funding it, because when you stop funding it, you actually allow things to fall into place where people won't tolerate the brutality that they live under. They won't have what they need to make it, and they'll say, well, maybe it is time for peace. Maybe it is time to form a Palestinian state that would be separate from Israel. Maybe it's time to give up the dream of driving Israel into the sea. Maybe that could happen. But as long as you fund it, you're just kicking the can down the road.